They assert that some secrets are revealed only when life is about to end, akin to whispers that come from the innermost parts of the soul. This time, it wasn't a rumor, a spectacular story that sprang from the media's wild imagination, or an assumption that was dismissed like so many others. This time, though, it was a sincere confession, delivered in a quiet voice, with eyes that were so filled with sorrow and fatigue that they were hardly able to remain open. Amid such silence that it seemed the air itself was quivering, Pope Francis delivered a few words that sent shivers down the spines of even those who had never allowed faith or believed. Jesus was far more than most people think. The Pope hesitated, as if the weight of centuries of spiritual weight were resting on his ailing shoulders, as if the greatest cathedral could not contain what he was about to say, nor could any ancient council sufficiently describe it. What was said in that? Out of fear, indifference, or a plain inability to see beyond, what did the Pope know that the rest of the world still ignores? Imagine, for a moment, the echo of that forgotten phrase in a darkened room, the scarcely audible crunch of the crucifix in its trembling fingers, the faint sound of its broken breath, and the deep trembling of a truth that has been held for a long time with an almost desperate zeal. What visions did he see in his last years? What did the lost manuscripts, the old prayers, and the mysterious whispers of the soul that inhabits the ethereal pages of history teach you? We will open a door that has been locked for decades because of power and fear. At any costs, many people wish to keep this door locked. Additionally, what is behind may fundamentally change how you view and comprehend Jesus. Are you really ready to hear what he has to say in his last moments? Even though Pope Francis is already in God's arms today, his voice is still heard in every heart that refuses to give up suffering or apathy. So before you start, if you truly love Jesus and are appreciative of what he taught us through his life and faith, please leave a loving tribute by saying, "Thank you, Holy Father." To continue your legacy of kindness, humility, and love for Christ, share this message, so that we can all remember that Jesus is still speaking through people who, like Francisco, didn't think twice about loving until the end. Please sign now if you haven't already. Come on, let's go. It all started in a modest Vatican room that was devoid of any imagined opulence. No secret cameras were there, and no statement was planned for other witnesses or future generations. Only a close-knit, intimate conversation laden with existential concerns. One that, under no circumstances, was ever meant to be made public. After great hesitation, motivated by duty and fear, he finally decided to speak after being heard that evening by a young, close-knit, and confident priest of the Pope. "Holy Father, do you think Jesus felt human fears?" It was a question that hung in the air like a subtle incense, its vague odor permeating the silence. With his eyes glued on an ancient crucifix made of discarded wood, Pope Francis responded in a rich, powerful, and modest voice. Jesus cried on the inside much more than the Gospels show, not only for the cross but mostly for us. The priest was speechless, trapped between wonder, veneration, and a reverent horror, but the Pope continued as if he needed to let go of a burden that was too big for him to bear. Was he in my dream? Could that have been a dream? I felt so real that it still hurts. Jesus looked at me and grieved. Was that a revelation of some kind? A prophetic vision? Perhaps a divine warning? The question now was not merely whether Jesus suffered physically, but also if his spiritual anguish was far more severe than we could have ever imagined. The grief is still reverberating in the deepest corners of the souls of those who dare to listen, silent but deafening. Holding a wobbly Bible with crumpled pages that were stained and scarred by decades of unrelenting prayer and searching, the Pope could not sleep that night. And among them, a passage began to deeply disturb and depress him, following him like a relentless echo that would not go away. Matthew 26 verses 26 to 37. But they were not only quaint, distant, and cold words. Wordless cries, living pain, and deep moans of misery seemed to be resounding in the very fabric of history. Francisco closed his eyes and felt everything with new vigor. In that vision, Jesus was by himself in Gethsemane. But there was another reason. He wasn't only because his sleeping and alien followers weren't present. He was just because he bore the weight of broken minds, unsaid imperfections, and invisible scars of humanity at large. "I saw his tears," the Pope remarked. "But they were collected by angels who were trembling with pain and did not fall to the ground." The confidant could not breathe when he heard Francisco continue, almost in a faint whisper. "God showed me that every tear of Jesus had a name, and one of them was mine. It was as though every word were carved into his soul." What did Francisco's request for access to ancient Vatican manuscripts and texts? Manuscripts that had been lost for centuries in dusty basements, shrouded in the obscurity of fear and oblivion, mean? If Francisco's revelation was that Jesus not only died for us, but also felt our sorrows and sorrows, then what did it mean that our stories, our flaws, and our wounds are recorded in their sacred tears? During that silent and desperate search, he found something that would change his view of Jesus forever. Letters from first-century martyrs, prophetic visions sealed to lime, gospels never added to the official canon, and singing out of fear or a prudence dictated by fear. According to a fragment attributed to an unnamed disciple, the teacher told us that centuries would come when the image of the Son would be distorted, that they would make him king, but they would forget his weeping. The sentence rocked him like a silent, devastating earthquake, but it was not heresy. Rather, it was a clear, painful, and urgent warning. Jesus did not come to be worshipped as a monarch on an impossible gold throne. He became known as a broken man of love for each of us, not as a distant God, but as a deeply wounded brother who embraced humanity until his last sighs. The Pope expressed this thought to his closest confidant in a low voice that sounded almost like a sigh. "We have made Jesus a motionless statue, but he continues to walk between us, with dirty feet and completely open heart, willing to break again and again for love." It was not a scandal or a provocation, but a desperate plea, a sincere cry to look at Jesus not as an untouchable and unattainable symbol, but as the Savior who cried for each of us, who cried with each of us, feeling in his flesh our own wounds. Francisco abruptly fell to his knees one night while praying by himself in the small chapel of Santa Marta. Not because he was physically weak or ill, but because of an unseen weight, an unavoidable spiritual burden that bent it from the bottom of his soul. "Lord, show me what I don't understand yet," he whispered in a barely audible voice. Something happened that is still only told in the Vatican's private newspapers, in sealed pages filled with silent tears instead of ink, and then a dim, warm, but unsettling light filled the place. But it was not a classical appearance like those described in devotional books. Rather, it was a living presence, an undeniable certainty that could not be explained or described with the limitations of human words. Instead of seeing Jesus as a triumphant and glorious king, the Pope saw him as a tired, bleeding, and broken man with an unending tenderness in his eyes that traveled through his soul like a silent, eternal ray. Then, he heard a phrase that stuck in his heart like an external echo rather than in his ears. "Don't come to understand me, I came to accompany me." Francisco, the man who represented the entire world before God, was reduced to a spiritual child before such a devastating revelation. He finally realized with a painful clarity that burned in every fiber of his being that his role was not just to defend a structured religion, but to reflect a broken, wounded heart that despite everything, he still loves, unconditionally. Days later, driven by an inexplicable inner need, Francisco summoned two cardinals of total trust into the seclusion of his most private rooms, and speaking in a tremulous voice, full of emotion and gravity, he related a part of his most profound and private spiritual experience, and one of them, looking pale and clearly disturbed, said, "Holy, does that mean that Jesus still suffers?" The Pope responded without hesitation, "Jesus is not dead in the past, he lives in each current suffering," with a great lot of seriousness and an old weight in his eyes. It was a vision of Jesus that did not openly contradict or deny the official dogmas, but it went beyond them in a profound and poignant way, revealing the Redeemer not only as the victorious victor of death, but also as the silent and mourning companion of every tiny death that a human being experiences on this planet, walking in silence with every young man who lacks a purpose in life, with every mother who loses his son, and with every person who cries to God in the privacy of his room and does not immediately hear back. Francisco was not a revolutionary seeking agitation, nor did he seek to alter church doctrine. His greatest secret, his greatest spiritual gift, was without a doubt to restore the living relationship to return us to the human Jesus who looks you in the eye with infinite tenderness, who sticks by your side when everyone else has abandoned you, when everything seems lost. It was a whisper between hearts that were willing to listen, not a formal sermon or public homily, and the cardinals left that meeting with a pale face, as if they had witnessed something that they could never forget or erase from their conscience. One of them, trembling when writing, left a paper testimony. The Pope spoke to us as though we no longer fear death, but rather the silence that leaves an unlocked truth, a truth too alive to be buried in oblivion. Francisco, unable to sleep that night, stayed in a candle and slowly went over, one by one, every moment of his pontificate, every decision made with pain or hope, every mistake made, every sentence thrown into the sky as a drowned cry, and in his heart a new and simultaneously previously known truth. Having faithfully served the institutional church, he now had to devote his last remaining strength to serving the living Jesus, the Jesus who lives in the flesh and in the cry of the forgotten. He was instructed to write a private letter that was neither a sober encyclical nor a message intended for a broad readership. It was a personal confession, an intimate testament, and a spiritual legacy that would only become evident after his physical death. He wrote in that letter, with a firm but wounded hand, Jesus did not come to worship him with reverent fear. He came to follow him with true and committed love. We have covered his shining gold cross and forgotten the true pain he endured in his vulnerable and exposed flesh. However, not everything in the Vatican was immediately accepted. Some conservative and fearful people viewed their words as dangerous, almost subversive. Every word of that letter was an open wound, a silent appeal to those hearts that were willing to hear it, a cry to ensure that faith did not become a meaningless ritual but rather a rebirth that was lively, throbbing, and burning. They whispered between the golden and cold corridors. The majestic image of the Messiah is weakening. Francisco knew, however, that what he had saw and felt profoundly could not be stifled or hushed. What if Jesus came back today and we didn't know who he was? In a small, hidden chapel away from the world's hustle and bustle, without cameras, flashes, or prepared speeches, he said, because we are still waiting for the glorious King to shine in majesty, but not the mourning brother who walks by our side in the shadows. The chapel was so quiet that it seemed as though time itself had stopped, holding the breath before the gravity of those words. Some people trembled without fully understanding why. Others lowered their heads, trapped by a truth they could not name but could no longer ignore, and others cried in silence as the Pope no longer preached from a throne of rigid authority. There had been a profound change in the air, something invisible but tangible for those who knew how to look. Francisco received the visit of a child with leukemia just before he became seriously ill, and he spoke not from the lofty echelons of an uncontested institution but from the open wound of love, from the human fragility that had hugged so much in silence. He was sowing a seed that, he knew, would only sprout long after his physical departure, in hearts willing to listen beyond dogma. The visit was short, planned in accordance with the official Vatican calendar, but the meeting went longer than expected. More than an hour of profound and silent communion. The child asked him, with utter innocence and in a shy but direct voice that only the innocent can have, "He does not fear the truth. Does Jesus the heart hurt like mine?" Francisco's life changed forever after that encounter. The Pope, with his crystalline eyes, fought with all his soul against the tears that he could no longer suppress at all. He answered, almost whispering, "Yours and his beat at the same rhythm when you cry." His homilies became more relaxed, more emotionally charged, and full of meaningful silences that said far more than words. Then came the silence, the progressive retirement, the quiet and resigned preparation for how inevitable it was already approaching. I was no longer looking for easy applause or expected ovations. Instead, I was trying to touch souls at their deepest roots and awaken sleeping hearts. Jesus will still want to speak after I am gone, but it must be acknowledged that even in those latter days before he departed for good, he gave his personal secretary a paper sealed with his fist, a final revelation, a final burning. He recounted in that document a unique night when he dreamed of Golgotha, but not as it is told in the traditional Gospels. He dreamed him as if the crucifixion were taking place right now in our day in the midst of modern indifference. I saw Jesus crucified in the middle of the city, surrounded by noise, in a hurry, of total indifference, but nobody looked. Everyone was too busy, absorbed in their phones, and hypnotized by screens that shone brighter than the stars as they passed. He wrote something unsettling, almost a lament drowned, and Jesus looked at me from the cross and said, "They did not forget for ignorance, they replaced me with entertainment. Is it a dream? Is it a divine warning? Or is it something deeper that we couldn't quite put our finger on? Because if Jesus is here today, if he really walks by our side, are we willing to see him again with new eyes, or have we forgotten how to look?" The document also mentioned a secret prayer that the Pope prayed every morning in total seclusion, away from cameras, protocols, and visible rituals. "Sir, would you be recognized or would you be crucified again if you came back in flesh and bone today?" he asked. Not an official sentence, nor was it in any approved or sanctioned missal, but it was a sincere, naked conversation, deeply human, with the Jesus he had met in his silent visions. It was a prayer that burned the soul, which did not seek solace but naked truth, and that confronted from the front without allowing evasions. Francisco came to the realization in his last days that few religious leaders even dare to think about. Jesus needs humble witnesses, souls who are willing to share your suffering, not powerful defenders or elaborate altars, and he had become one of them in his physical weakness, in his painful and long illness, in his wounded humanity. Like the Pope, they don't remind me. His final will was simple, written with a trembling hand but firm. He did it out of silent conviction and genuine love, not because he was powerful. Remember the man who spoke to me in tears? Jesus is much closer than we realize and much closer than we dare to imagine in the midst of everyday chaos. Yet he no longer speaks to us through thunder or enormous visual signs. He remarked calmly, "Listen to it, before the clamor of the world renders us permanently deaf." He now speaks in whispers, in soft murmurs that, if one dares to listen, touch and tear the soul. Since then, the contents of that sealed letter, that personal legacy that aims for inner transformation rather than scandal or controversy, have been the focus of endless debate among theologians, priests, and faithful worldwide. Is it a genuine revelation, or is it the compassionate delirium of an elderly man in his last days, when the veil between this world and the other becomes thinner, more transparent? For many, it remains an inexplicable mystery, but for those who truly knew him, who saw beyond the protocol, beyond the white cassock, and beyond the throne of Peter, that was the point at which the Pope ceased to be an institutional figure and transformed into something infinitely deeper. A mirror, a clear and crude reflex of the human soul, a living reminder of our wounds and our hopes, because his revelation did not speak of the end of the world as we hear it, nor of argumentative apocalyptic catastrophes. He spoke of the forgotten principle of the heart, the lost root of compassion and presence, which is even more urgent and necessary. Today, that letter is carefully guarded and rests in a private vault, away from the media's buzz and the desire for quick news, but some of its lingering fragments have been shared in small circles of genuine faith in a low voice, not to stir up controversy but to awaken souls and cause internal rebirths. Is Jesus speaking to you now and you haven't heard it yet? Look around you, hold on. Where is the heaviest silence, the deepest pain, the crying that no one can see, the quiet loneliness that weighs as much as lead in the heart? That's the most powerful question that comes to mind even though Jesus is still alive and breathing among us. Perhaps, just maybe, what the Pope revealed was not a secret for a few chosen enlightened, but an eternal, straightforward, and potent truth that was always there, patiently waiting for us to open the eyes of the heart and the ears of the soul. His words resonate more now than ever before, like a whisper that transcends time, not in grand basilic life or glowing gold thrones, but in hospital beds where invisible battles are fought, in hugs that no longer exist, and in tears that are lost in the dark without witnesses. These simple yet impactful words, "Don't wear my image, my cross accompanies," capture the living, throbbing essence of everything Francisco wanted to convey to the world, beyond speeches, doctrines, or theological debates. Real Christianity, authentic Christianity, is not a religion of cold statues or repeated rites without soul or conscience, but of living hearts that beat the same compass as the suffering teachers. The Pope finally understood, not as a theological concept but as a visceral certainty, on the edge of his last sigh on this earth. Jesus is not far away, and he has never stopped walking with us. It is here, now, in the broken breathing of the exhausted who can hardly breathe, in the lost and wounded look of the desperate who no longer knows how to ask for help, in your own soul when chlorators without words, when all that is left is the silent groan of the heart. You may not remember every word of this video, every detail of this story we have told you, but it doesn't matter. You don't have to commit everything to memory. So, when the time came, he wasn't afraid to leave because he didn't actually go, but instead he simply returned with the peace of a son to the embrace of the one who never left him alone for a moment. And you? Are you willing to go back, to take the path back, to let you find again? If anything should be etched in your heart like a fire, like a permanent tattoo in your spirit, that is it. Jesus does not wait for you on cold altars or in meaningless liturgies. Rather, he will find you in the places where you feel hopeless and on your darkest evenings. If you listen to it, if you let the whisper that breaks all silence into your soul, it will speak to you. Not through speeches or big, thunderous revelations, but through that little voice that beats to the beat of your suffering. What Pope Francis revealed was not a prophecy for some distant, uncertain, and intangible future. Do not ignore, turn off, or bury it in the distraction if, as you read or listen to this story, you feel something move, vibrate, or awaken in the depths of your being. Instead, open it and hold it, for that slight tremor may be the sign that Jesus himself is calling you, that he has been whispering your name with an infinite patience, with a tireless love that never tires of waiting. It was an urgent revelation for the present, for this exact moment, for you here and now, in the location where you are reading or hearing these words. I'm telling this story for the person who still silently pronounces your name today, not for me, tradition, or commitment, but for you if you feel the same way. If you want to keep journeying together, subscribe. Leave a remark if something has affected your life, but more importantly, listen carefully for Jesus has much more to teach you. Maybe in that whisper, you will find the life you have been looking for. I will see you soon.